Podcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Well, good morning, everybody, and welcome to conversation number 4. Looking forward to working with you in the next half now and perhaps make sense of the fourth of the 5 conversations framework. So at this stage, you should be through 3 conversations, and if you haven't, then I suggest you get on your bike and get those done, whether it means being on the receiving end or perhaps even running them yourselves as a team leader or manager, because we need to get through the process. So let's look at what we're covering in this short, sharp session. And like always, if you've got questions or comments that you want to make, please do so over on the right-hand side under the question box. I'll keep an eye on it. And as soon as I see a question or a comment, I'm more than willing to stop and deal with that, because these sessions are really about you and how you can be better equipped and prepared to have these conversations, or to get the very best out of them anyway. Okay, so 3 things that we'll look at in this short session. We will consider the 5 conversations framework again, so understand where the learning and development conversation actually fits into the 5 conversations framework. For example, why are we having it now? Why didn't we have it at the beginning? What purpose does it serve, and so forth. We'll also then look at the actual questions related to the learning and development conversation, and there's quite a few questions involved in this, but I should say to you that, again, it's not a question of reading these out. The idea is to pick and choose the ones that are relevant to you, because you'll find some of them aren't necessarily relevant, and just to have a conversation with the other person about their learning and development needs. And I'll finish up this webinar, as I have for the other 3, and will continue in number 5, is look at some tips and hints to improve the quality of your conversation. So we've had lots of interesting feedback. We've had people that have had a really enriching experience in these conversations. We've had others that have struggled a little bit. Most people are finding their way. So it should be a case of always trying to improve the quality of these conversations, whether you're on the receiving end or leading them yourself. So that's what we'll do in this short, sharp session. Look at those 3 key points. Okay. So look, at this stage, I'd be surprised if people didn't know what the purpose of the 5 conversations was about, having already had 3. But I'm going to mention this each time because I think it's important that if you're a manager or a team leader, you should be able to respond to this question. And likewise, if you're and let's face it, you're all on the receiving end of the conversation at some point in the process, you should be able to know the rationale or reason for doing this. So let me just reiterate that, because I think it's important we understand the big picture before we get into the detail. So the purpose of the 5 conversations framework is to build higher levels of trust. Now, how could that be? Well, by having regular, relatively structured conversations with the people that you are working with, we assume that trust levels will build, because it'll be clear about where people stand on certain things. There'll be an awareness of people's strengths and opportunities for growth. We will be aware of people's job satisfaction and so forth. So we're hoping that levels of trust are increased. Now, how will we know that? Well, you might recall at the beginning of this process, we completed an online assessment, and what that assessment tool was trying to do was to give us a benchmark before we undertook the 5 conversations framework. And then, of course, at the end of the 5 conversations, we will then benchmark the organisation again. And what we're hoping for, of course, is that there's been some improvement in the areas such as trust. We're trying to create some synergy. What do I mean by that? Well, we're all on the same page, but often we forget this. We're all in a business organisation doing things for our internal customers in that IT space. And it's really important that we gain some degree of synergy and break down those boundaries that can often occur between people and units and so forth. We're also trying to develop ways and means of assisting people to excel in their work. And so a lot of the questions, as you'd be aware, are very much around those that very sentiment. So that's the purpose of the 5 conversations. Now, it's not really, as I've said before, a de facto performance review. It's not really about that. There is some legal requirements to have a performance review, and I acknowledge that, but these conversations go in and around those performance reviews. So really what should happen is that those performance reviews actually run more effectively. Why? Because there's a little bit more comfort, rapport, a little bit more trust and synergy and so forth. And some of the questions perhaps could be answered in conversation format. So it's really important not to assume that this is just some de facto performance review in disguise. It's not, and I want to keep making that point so that people understand that. But essentially, that's the purpose of the 5 conversations framework. Okay, now we are up to number 4 on the list of conversations, and what are we actually trying to do in this conversation? Why do we have a learning and development conversation? Well, it might be fairly self-explanatory with the title, but what are we actually trying to do? Well, what we're trying to do is we're trying to summarize the learning and development opportunities that have come out of the previous 2 conversations. Now, you might recall that conversation 2 was around strengths and talents. So we started off working and talking about people's strengths and talents. It's a far more affirmative place to start, talking about what people have innate talents towards. But nevertheless, out of that conversation, there were probably some learning and development opportunities that perhaps weren't captured. Now, when I say learning and development opportunities, I'm not necessarily referring to sending people off to courses, although that, of course, is part of it. But it may well be about coaching. It may well be about showing someone how to do something that they perhaps didn't know or didn't want to ask before. It may be about some form of mentoring. So I'm talking about learning development in its very broad sense here, not about just sending people off to classroom-style learning, as good as and as relevant as it can be at times. Now, the second or the third conversation, of course, was opportunities for growth. Now, in that conversation, we were talking about 1 or 2 areas where people could just, develop and grow in their own particular field. Again, there was probably some opportunities, some learning and development opportunities that weren't necessarily captured in that conversation. So out of those 2 conversations, that's conversation 2 and 3, we have an opportunity to have a learning and development conversation, which allows us to kind of aggregate some of the important development opportunities that have arisen from the previous 2 conversations. Of course, it doesn't preclude conversation 1, which of course was a climate review, which is very much around job satisfaction, morale, and communication. So hopefully that's made it clear to you why we're having this conversation at this time during the framework. Now, you've seen this slide undoubtedly before, but it's really the framework in its totality. And you can see the order of progression over on the left-hand side from month 1 through to month 5. And we've kind of tried to keep to that four weekly cycle. And there's a reason for that, of course, is that, if we don't do it, what happens is busyness gets in the way. And then it's month 2 and we haven't got into the first one. And by the end of the year, we haven't finished. So that's why we're pushing you. So if you haven't done conversation 3, and I hope you have, please get on with it. Because we need to keep things moving. But you can see the progression there, and I've talked about the climate review and then the strengths and talents conversation, opportunities for growth, and the learning and development conversation. And the final conversation that we'll look at is the innovation and continuous improvement conversation. You might say, well, what's the difference between innovation and continuous improvement in the learning and development conversation? Well, there's a very clear difference. The learning and development conversation is about developing the person. So this is very much focused on the person in the conversation. Whereas the innovation and continuous improvement conversation is very much focused on the workplace. And what I mean by that is what surrounds you. There are obviously a lot of things that you can't control, but in your area of influence, there may well be things that you can suggest that might improve the efficiency or effectiveness of the organisation or the area that you're working in. So that's why we have conversation 5, the last conversation in the process. All right, so if you've got any questions, comments, observations, don't forget you can type them in the question box there, and I will deal with those ASAP. Now, this very busy slide, which will come up very shortly on your screen, there we go, gives you the questions, and you might say, wow, 13 questions, how will we get through that? You will find that in some of the cases here, you won't need to ask the question. I'm just giving you a totality of the conversation so you can see how it flows. But obviously, depending on what you've got to say, if you're on the receiving end or if you're the team leader or manager, and you know the person and the circumstances, it'll depend on how many of these questions you answer. But nevertheless, let me just say to you, I've explained that learning and development is more than just sending people off to training courses. I should also say that learning and development encompasses 3 dimensions. And the 3 dimensions are these. There's technical learning, which is very relevant to the work that you do in your area. There is personal development, which of course is not so much about the technical, but more about the person. And there's problem-based learning. So I would estimate that probably 80% of learning and development budgets are dedicated to technical development, and probably 20% to personal development, and then very little, if any, in the problem-based development. So the reason I'm raising that is that you'll find that the flow of questions are around technical, personal, and problem-based, because I want to cover all bases. I think there's too much emphasis on technical, notwithstanding its importance, no doubt, and there's too little on problem-based learning, and perhaps not quite so little on personal development. I'm not suggesting that we should go 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, but I just want to be mindful of covering all 3 dimensions so that the person, that we've had a thorough conversation around people's learning and development at this stage in the framework. Okay, so let's get underway. So what are we going to ask first? Well, a good place to start, you might recall the very first conversation question in conversation 1 is, on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate your job satisfaction? Well, we're coming back to some numbers here. How would you rate your technical skills on a scale of 1 to 10? 10 being high, 1 being low. Now, I know that's a broad question, and the person on the receiving end might say it depends on what you're talking about in relation to technical skills, but it's just a good place to start, because we're going to be talking about technical learning very shortly, so we might as well get underway. And most people won't rate that a 10. I'd be surprised, because there's always things to learn, isn't there, in our technical capabilities. And I'd be surprised if anyone rated it a 1 as well, because obviously I would suggest that they'd be struggling in their project work if they had problems around technical skills. Nevertheless, most people, nearly everyone, will fall between 2 and 9, and that gives the person an opportunity to think about their technical skills. And then you might launch into the question around what technical areas do you think you have mastered? So again, using the strength-based approach, let's start with the positives. What technical areas do you think you've mastered? So let's talk about some of the things, maybe even you might get into some of the projects that people have actually undertaken and which, were specific in an area, and talk a little bit around that. So again, if you're the leader of this conversation, just listen. If you are participating in this conversation, which is everybody, then make sure that you're prepared for this. It's pointless going in not being blindsided by these statements and questions. It's important that you give it some thought so that the conversation flows very naturally. Then you might move into the area of what technical areas of your job could be improved. Okay? Now, if you are going into this conversation with your team member or your manager, it would be a good idea to mention something there. It's quite dubious to think that people can't improve in any way, shape and form, particularly in your profession, which is so fast changing. The digital technology is changing so quickly and rapidly and morphing and changing. There must be some areas that are in need of improvement. So by focusing on that, of course, if you're the leader, you may well know what that person needs in that area, but the important thing is to get them involved in the conversation, let them talk about what they think they need to improve on. And of course, in number 4, question 4, this helps the other person elaborate a little bit on that. So you might ask, so why did you say that? Or can you give me an example? So what you're looking for is an opportunity for people to talk about a project or a critical incident where they perhaps were struggling a little bit in that technical area that they've identified as an area for improvement. So take your time, be patient, just listen and take in what they're saying and absorb it. You may have seen them involved in that or you may not. So just let them talk because you want to get a full understanding of what they mean when they talk about that area of improvement. So what you've done there is those 4 questions are really around the technical skills that I talked about. Although I haven't got subheadings here, you can see that there's a change of focus in question 5, which basically asks, what are some areas that you would like to develop in personally or explore further in your own growth to help you become even more effective and efficient in your work? Now, these areas could be stakeholder management, time management, they could be project management, although you could argue that that sort of spills over into technical. It could be assertion skills. There's a bunch of areas there. So I want you to have a think before you go into this conversation about some of those areas that you feel that you need to work on in your own personal growth. And again, I'd be surprised if there wasn't something that you could perhaps work on in your personal growth. Perhaps it's a team building, that's a personal growth area. There's a whole host of things that I'm sure people will mention in the conversation. So in question 6, ask the question, why did you say that? So, you want them, of course, to elaborate on that. And then you perhaps in question 7 can say, can you cite an example? So this anchors it back into the reality of the workplace where this person perhaps might have been struggling in their personal growth because of a situation or incident that they were involved in. So by asking those 2 questions, you're clarifying in your mind as the leader and in the mind of the person on the receiving end, it's clarifying in their mind what it is specifically that they need to work on. All right, so those three questions are around personal development, you see. So we've done technical skills, we've now looked at personal skills, and now in question 8, we're going to start looking at problem-based learning. Now, let's face it, in your profession, you are given a whole bunch of problems often to resolve. Some of the work, of course, might be quite routine, but in many cases, it's the case where you have been put in a situation where it's not quite so obvious what the solution may be. So question 8 is addressing that. So question 8 is, what problems or dilemmas have you had to deal with over the past few months that were challenging? Now, why do I say the past few months? Well, it's probably easy to remember the past 2 months. It's fresh in your mind, and so therefore people can focus on that. I'd be surprised if people weren't challenged at all in any situation or any project work. I'm sure it's been the case. So again, if you're preparing for this conversation, I'd like you to give some thought to that so that you can answer that meaningfully and perhaps usefully. Question 9, what happened? So the what happened is really just giving the person the opportunity to share the actual critical incident or the project or maybe the outcome of that or how they felt about themselves in that process. Question 10 is around how did you approach the situation? So it gives the person on the receiving end an opportunity to talk even further about the project. And what did you learn from it? Which is a good question to ask there at that stage, because normally when something challenging happens, there's always a learning opportunity there. And of course, question 12 could be around how would you do things differently next time? Now, you know, what would you do differently? Because clearly there must have been something that they needed to do differently. So if you look at that, we've got from question 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12 is problem-based learning. So you can see now that there's a little bit of logic behind these 13 questions. And finally, question 13 is what knowledge, skills, or capabilities would have helped you deal with the issue you raised with me or the issues you raised with me? So what you're trying to do here is sum up the learning and development needs of that person moving forward. Now, you don't necessarily have to write this down. I guess you can if you want to, but, you know, this is what we would normally call a training needs analysis. So we're actually trying to establish the needs of people, but the difference is that we're doing this via conversation. So you're probably going to pick up a couple of gems as a leader as to what you might be able to do to accommodate that team member's learning in the future. Obviously, you know, you may have to get approval from someone else to do that, but nevertheless, at least it's on the table and it can be referred to later. So that's the 13 questions. It's pretty straightforward. As I say, some of those you can go through fairly quickly. It may take you more than 15 minutes, depending on the person you're dealing with. But as I said earlier on in this series, I don't think it's problematic that it does take longer than 15 minutes. Sometimes it needs to be discussed. So there you go. There's the 13 questions, and you might like to take them on a laptop or a you know, whatever, an iPad, or even on your phone or piece of paper or whatever works for you, and just refer to them as you go through the conversation. And the person on the receiving end, you might like to have them in front of you as well. It's not necessary, but it'll often help you to keep you on track. All right, now let me finish off. We've got about 5 minutes. I just want to go through some do's and don'ts in terms of making these conversations even more effective. So I say coach and coachee. I know you're not formally a coach if you're a team leader or a manager, but just for argument's sake, you know what I mean. And then, of course, on the right-hand side, we're talking about the coach. The coach, of course, would be the team leader or manager in this case, whereas the coachee would be everybody who would be in this broadcast, who at some stage will be on the receiving end of a conversation. So the coachee, yes, do some preparation, come to the meeting having thought about those 13 statements and questions so that you're not sitting there saying, I haven't thought about that. Take the initiative and book the conversation. If your team leader or manager hasn't got back to you, then that's a cue that you need to get on and talk to them about booking a time to have your conversation. So be constructive and open-minded, because there may be cases where you agree to disagree, or there is, your leader has a different point of view. Before you jump down their throat, it might be a good idea to just listen to what they have to say, ask them to elaborate on what they have to say, and perhaps spend a little bit of time evaluating whether or not what they have to say has any substance to it at all. So agree to disagree wherever possible. As I said, this is not an opportunity to have some disagreement or argument. It's really an opportunity to have a conversation. But inevitably in a conversation, people won't always agree. And remember, this is not, as I said earlier on, a performance review. So it's a conversation between two people on equal terms, albeit the person you're conversing with is your team leader or manager. Now, if you're the coach, what should you do or not do? So a couple of key things. Obviously, consider the questions before you set out on it, because I mean, it's you should just go over those in your mind. You don't need to answer them in your mind, because of course you're the one just having the conversation. Let the coachee respond however they choose. Book a time and a place that's mutually suitable, which is very important, because you don't want people sitting there stressed about some workload that they have. So make sure that, be mindful and sensitive of the need to book a time that's mutually convenient, not just for you. Consider meeting out of the office. I know many people are doing this, and I think it's a great thing. Sometimes the best conversations can happen over coffee. I know one leader who's doing their conversations having a walk through the botanical gardens. Not a problem, and it works really well for them. So, get out of the office. If you're stuck in having 3 conversations in the office, you might find it's quite refreshing. Refer to the questions, but don't read them off, because if you read them off, it's not really a conversation, is it? So just refer to them and say them in your own words with your own personality. Be patient. Let the person finish what they're saying before you launch into the next big question. So let people elaborate. And then once that's been exhausted, move on to the next question. And of course, be what I call respectfully curious. And respectfully curious means be prepared to ask open-ended questions. Why, what, when, who, where, how, and which. And that draws out of the other person an opportunity for them to elaborate on the point that they'd made earlier. And so it's good practice for you as a leader just to allow people to continue. So guys, that's it for me. I think we're pretty much done. I'm just checking to see if we have any questions. No, that's all good. So enjoy the 4th conversation. Tony, of course, is your point of contact there. I know Tony's in attendance today. We will put this up on the ShareSource site this afternoon as soon as I've uploaded it to YouTube. So refer to it as many times as you like, and the slides will be available as well. So thanks, guys. Look forward to hearing your war stories down the track, and have fun and take care. Thank you.